How does cognition fluctuate over time, over weeks, even within a day? We know there are circadian influences, like depending on the time of day, some people might be more cognitively sharp than others. We might be able to identify Alzheimer's disease earlier than using something like this, like the earliest sign that there's memory loss, tracking cognitive recovery after stroke or traumatic brain injury, tied to cognitive rehabilitation. Just the ability to measure cognition in real world dynamic environments with good technology, I think, will revolutionize our field.
What is up, fam? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Phil Sarpon, and this is Phil's Guide to PsyD. This channel is dedicated to all things psychology, wellness, and graduate school. Today we have a very special video. We have two guests who are board certified neuropsychologists who are going to be coming to talk about neuropsychology, how to get into it, what the training is like, research experience, dissertation, clinical practice, and so much more. And I'm really excited for this conversation with Dr. Ryan Van Patten and Dr. John Bellone. A little bit of an overview of these clinicians. As I mentioned before, Dr. Van Patten is a board certified neuropsychologist. He's also an assistant professor at Brown University and also works as a neuropsychologist at the Providence VA Medical Center in Providence, Rhode Island. He is an active researcher, clinician, and educator. He is also on several editorial boards for the Journal in Neurology, Psychiatry, Geriatrics, and Neuropsychology. Dr. John Bellone is also a board certified clinical neuropsychologist. He specializes in assessing adults with concerns about their memory and other cognitive abilities. He completed some of his training at Loma Linda University as well as Yale University as his doctoral internship and Brown University for his postdoctoral fellowship. He is a consultant for one of the teams in the National Hockey League. He's also the member of several neuropsychological organizations. He has lectured extensively on the power of exercise, healthy diet, sleep, psychological well-being, and cognitively staying healthy through social support. Both Dr. Bellone and Dr. Van Patten are the authors of a book called Becoming a Neuropsychologist: Advice and Guidance for Students and Trainees. I strongly encourage you to pick up the copy of this book. This book is phenomenal. I've actually read through it in my own journey of wanting to see if I wanted to go into the neuropsychology realm. And I think they do a fantastic job of detailing all of the steps in order to become a neuropsychologist in the United States. So as I mentioned, I'm really excited to jump into this conversation. Before we do, if you have not already, please subscribe to the channel. You can also like this video and share this video. The more subscribers we get, the more likes and shares that we get, the more opportunities that people who are already looking into graduate school will be able to find this video and this content. And so I would really appreciate that. If you would like additional content, you can always also become a member by joining below, and you will get access to other videos that we have not released yet. As always, thank you so much for the support. Let's go ahead and jump right into the video. All right, Dr. Van Patten, Dr. Bellone, thank you all for being here. I'm really looking forward to this podcast and this YouTube session. So thank you both for your time.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us. We're happy with the invitation and love your work that you're doing. So thanks again.
Very much appreciated. Well, I'll jump right in. One of the things that I've been getting a lot of questions about is neuropsychology. What exactly is neuropsychology? You both are board certified neuropsychologists. You have your own podcast and a book and things that we'll definitely get into later on. But I think for me, the first time I heard the term neuropsychology probably wasn't until like a year before even starting graduate school. And then I got into graduate school and started learning a little bit more about it. But there are so many different questions. How would you define neuropsychology, especially compared to psychology or clinical psychology, which is probably a little bit more of a familiar term for people?
Sure. I can jump in, and then John, you can correct me like you usually do at the end.
Sure. Happy to.
So neuropsychology is a science and profession. The two pieces of the word sort of say it all, right? Neuro, brain, psychology, behavior. So the field really integrates knowledge and interest and work that relates to our brains, and then what we do, what our brains help us do, how we think, our actions, our cognitions. So, that's a general way to think about the field. The way it's structured or organized in the US in particular is that neuropsychology is a specialization within clinical psychology. So you can think of, you mentioned, Phil, the more familiar term. I learned the word psychology when I was young, but like you, I didn't know what the heck neuropsychology was until later in college. Neuropsychology is a specialization within clinical psych. So if somebody is interested in becoming a psychologist who helps people, who does clinical work with patients, there's a lot of different ways to do that, which we could talk about, different things to specialize in. And one option among the many would be neuropsychology.
I think how I think about it, which is helpful sometimes, is that all neuropsychologists are psychologists, just as all neurologists are physicians, but not all psychologists are neuropsychologists. It's really a niche specialty under the umbrella of psychology, with neuropsychologists receiving more targeted formal training in brain behavior relationships and assessment. That's what separates us from the broader umbrella term of psychology.
Would it be kind of a fair comparison to say, when like medical students go through their medical school program, they go into their residency, and then from their residency, sometimes they do a fellowship after that, as people who want to go into the psychology field, going into that clinical psychology field, getting the PhD or PsyD in psychology, and then the internship, and then the postdoc or fellowship kind of maybe mimics a little bit of the medical field. Is that kind of a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's the idea. The fellowship in particular is where we become neuropsychologists. We do start neuropsych training much earlier. Ryan and I both had neuropsych training in our doctoral program and internship, but that's really to set us up for the postdoctoral fellowship, which, we could talk more about the process of becoming a neuropsychologist. But yeah, that fellowship is really, I think, the internship and fellowship are really similar to the residency and then a fellowship that the neurologists or any other specialty under the American Medical Board would go into.
A question that I also get a lot is there a difference between a clinical neuropsychologist and a neuropsychologist?
There's so many words, so many terms, right? And little distinctions, and it might not be clear. It's understandable why people would wonder that. Those terms are often used synonymously. Most neuropsychologists are clinical neuropsychologists. There's a subset of people who would identify as neuropsychologists who do not do clinical work. Clinical work meaning seeing, helping, assessing, treating patients. And so, most neuropsychologists have that as at least a small portion of what they're doing in their professional careers, but there is a subset who don't. For those who don't, many of them are in research. I would say it's probably most neuropsychologists who are not clinical neuropsychologists do research. Then again, we might call them clinical neuropsychologists in the sense that their research, by and large, is clinically oriented, even if they're not seeing patients directly. Most of them will be, leading research studies, writing papers, writing grants with the overarching idea, the goal of learning something, doing science that will help patients. So that's one way to think about it.
There are also people doing just administrative or teaching, duties who could have had training in neuropsychology and could be either a clinical neuropsychologist or a neuropsychologist. Really, there's not a formal established difference between the two like there is for maybe the difference between psychology and neuropsychology. We kind of use it more fluidly. Ryan's a good example of doing both research and clinical neuropsychology, so he could be considered either of them.
Yeah, it's one of the great things about our field. It's what drew me to the field in large part is I remember learning just how flexible a job can be in clinical psychology broadly and neuropsychology specifically. You have a lot of room for diverse interests. If you want to primarily do clinical work, some people do 100% clinical, some people are 100% research. Other people mix in other things like teaching, administration, brain health advocacy. There are just so many different interesting and exciting areas to get into within neuropsych, and so it can make the terminology can get confusing, but I enjoy it because there's a lot to do, a lot of interesting things.
Oh, that's so cool. And I know both of you kind of briefly mentioned sort of the pathway to becoming a neuropsychologist, kind of going through grad school and the internship and the fellowship. And it's such a long pathway to even get to that step of becoming a neuropsychologist or a clinical neuropsychologist. What kind of sparked y'all's interest and desire to even pursue this, especially with the long path ahead of you?
It is a long, windy, and expensive journey. Typically, there's some ways to make it a little less painful, but which we can talk about. But Ryan and I have a similar story of what got us interested. So I'll go first, so I can steal his thunder on it. But really, the brief kind of version is that I was really interested in philosophy and science early on, and I wanted a career that would allow me to continue to study the brain and these philosophical concepts like free will and cognitive maps, things like that. Also continue to kind of contribute to the scientific literature, understanding. And then I really liked working one-on-one with patients and getting to know people. So I wanted that to be an aspect of my job. Wanted to make a decent salary. So, all these things kind of just converged into this field as I started to learn more and more about neuropsychology just as an option. So kind of started out broadly in psychology and then narrowed down into neuropsychology as I learned more. I'll just quickly mention, I really liked how we as neuropsychologists get to spend a lot of time with patients, much more than other brain-related specialists, and really dive into people's lives and help them in a hopefully a profound way.
Yep. What you mentioned earlier, Phil, about not learning about neuropsychology until college, I've found that's true for me, and that's true for a lot of my colleagues that I talk about. As John mentioned, he and I have a similar story. Other folks I've talked to also say, I didn't know about neuropsychology. It's not like people are 5 years old or 7 years old, at school, and they're saying, I want to become a neuropsychologist, because we don't learn about it. We don't learn that it even exists until much later. At least I'm sure some people do, like children of neuropsychologists probably do. But otherwise, for me and others that I know, you don't learn about the field until later. The one thing that really helps with the long, windy road that John mentioned is if you are curious, interested, passionate about the brain, about how people work, psychology, if you feel like those areas are for you something that just naturally are interesting, in that, reading about the brain, reading about psychiatry and how people, what makes people tick, that kind of thing, if that really does it for you, that very much helps, given how long and challenging the road can be. You don't want all that time to go into something if it's a drag, if it's I just want to do 9 to 5 and get home, and I don't want to do this neuropsychology thing anymore. You could be successful and get through grad school with that sort of mentality, but in terms of enjoying the process, and leaning into it, I think it helps a lot. If neuropsychology, if those topics are something that's just innately interesting to the person. So, my story, similar to John's, I had a general interest in everything I mentioned: neurology, neuroscience, philosophy, psychology for years. There's an abnormal psychology book when I was a teenager that I came across. It was an old one from the 80s. I just so happened to page through it. I read about psychoanalysis and behaviorism and cognitive therapy and was just fascinated, and I knew I wanted to do something related to brain and mind. I didn't know what. I was on the path planning to go into neurology in college, and then had my spark, the moment, eureka, learning that neuropsychology existed, and it was the perfect blend of all my interests. And so the rest is history.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. I guess a follow-up question to that is, then what does your typical day look like now as a practicing neuropsychologist? I think you mentioned a little bit of the research part and the clinical part, but I'm curious in terms of the percentage for both of you, how much you do on either side.
Yeah, good question. And this will vary a lot one neuropsychologist to another. For me, lots of diversity. I enjoy a mix of research, teaching, mentorship, clinical work, some administrative responsibilities, and that makes each day different and unique. But to give you an example or two, on a clinically oriented day, I am seeing patients for the most part. So getting into the office, I work at a VA, Veterans Medical Center in Providence, Rhode Island. So going to the office, reviewing the chart from the patient or patients that I'm going to see that day. Often I squeeze in a little bit of research if I can in the morning. But then, preparing, getting a background and conceptualization, understanding this person who I'm going to be working with and doing a neuropsychological evaluation with, often having meetings with trainees who I work with who will be seeing the patient with me. Then patient arrives, we go through the whole neuropsychological evaluation process, which John and I could talk through later if that's of interest. After that, spending time on an ongoing basis, meeting with the trainee, talking through the case, writing the report for that day. Might have feedback appointments for different patients who I've seen a few weeks ago, giving them the results, talking to colleagues like physicians and social workers about the patients we're seeing to try to, have a team-based approach. And then, in the afternoon, who knows? It varies a lot. Research days are super variable, but involve things like reading scientific literature, analyzing data, writing grants or papers, meetings with other colleagues to talk through research questions and ideas that we have, and a lot of other things. Having podcasts with bright people like you, Phil, which is always fun.
My days, similar to Ryan's clinical days, because my day job is all clinical. So I am typically reviewing medical records before the patient comes in. Then I do a clinical interview with the patient. I do my own testing, and then score up the testing, give the feedback, write the report. That takes up a lot of my time, is the report writing. So neuropsychology is definitely a writing job, as much as a seeing people kind of job, which you get used to. Sometimes it's a little burdensome, but it's just second nature now. That's my kind of clinical day. I don't have trainees at the moment, but then I have a whole second life where I do, all these side gigs like NavNeuro podcast that Ryan mentioned. I get roped into research projects with Ryan. He's constantly trying to get me to do some new meta-analysis or qualitative analysis of something. So it's cool. I can kind of keep my foot in that pool of science and research without it having to completely take over my life, because I really enjoy the clinical work. And then I also have some side clinical jobs. I have a contract with the Department of State Hospitals where I see patients who have been found, not guilty for reasons of insanity, just as one example, and they're now being conditionally released, and so sometimes they need an evaluation for that. I'm the neuropsychologist for the Anaheim Ducks, the NHL team in Southern California here. So after someone has a concussion, after a player has a concussion during the season, I am involved in the return to play decision process and testing their cognitive abilities. So we're on the advisory board, both Ryan and I, for the new to neuropsychology organization. So we have just like so many side projects in addition to our normal day jobs that we get paid, for. So, which is cool. It keeps us involved and interested in a way that I don't think we would be doing in other professions. So.
That is amazing. I think from the both of you, I heard just so much variety, so much diversity within clinical psychology, neuropsychology, clinical research, teaching. And I think it's really great. I think that's part of the reason why I was attracted to the clinical psychology profession as well. And I heard a little bit of, I guess I do have a little bit of a follow-up question for you, John, in terms of, I heard a little bit of like maybe forensic psychology and sports psychology in kind of the consultations that you're doing. Is that kind of accurate as well in terms of some of that contract work?
Right, definitely sports neuropsychologists, is part of my job. Again, not my day job, but my kind of side gig, which I just lucked into this position. I was the backup for the team, the NHL team for several years, and then they asked me to become the primary. So that's a whole kind of different area, which is so fun and different from anything else that I do. And then I kind of am forensic light with the Department of State Hospitals. I don't, I haven't been asked to, I haven't been deposed or been asked to testify yet in court, although that could happen, but I'm sort of in that realm without having to do all of the work involved in actually being, my job is mainly, as a clinical neuropsychologist to assess those patients rather than a forensic neuropsychologist. But that is definitely another big area that neuropsychologists often go into, and it's very different from other types of clinical work. It pays a lot better. There are a lot of aspects to it, the forensic side of things. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. No, that's amazing. That's incredible. And I'm wondering too, some of the conversations I've had with other neuropsychologists has been, it just definitely seems like the field is growing. There's more opportunities. It also seems like it's becoming more common to get board certified in neuropsychology. I'm also wondering about maybe even some of the advancements in technology. A lot of professions are talking about AI and so forth. And I'm curious from the both of you, what do you feel like are maybe some of the more exciting advancements or technological uses that could be implemented into neuropsychology? And what could the field of neuropsychology look like within 5 or 10 years from now?
I love this question. I like how you think, Phil. I think the three of us here, are like-minded in that regard, being interested in tech and innovation and how it might apply to neuropsychology. There are a lot of great answers. John and I will try to keep this brief and not talk for 2 hours about all of the potential routes that our field is going and can go to improve. So I'll just briefly mention a few. If I had to pick one area that I think is both realistic, on the horizon, coming soon in terms of being infused into neuropsychology, and also a game changer, I would say mobile cognitive testing, which is what it sounds like. It is cognitive testing that is done using smartphones in people's natural environments. So the traditional way to do neuropsychology, the way we do it now, and the way it should continue to be done, at least sometimes, is bringing people into a clinic or a research lab. You bring somebody in, this person has questions about their cognitive functioning, and they meet personally with a neuropsychologist and or a technician, a psychometrist who does the testing, and they go through an in-depth cognitive test battery and other tasks to measure mental health and medical history and other things. So that model is tried and true. We use it. It's helpful. We go in depth sometimes. It's good to be in person to observe behavior. It's also limited in that this individual has to come to us, and it's a big production. There's a lot of time and resources on all sides that go into each time we measure cognitive functioning. It's also being done in a relatively sterile and unrealistic environment. We do that on purpose. We bring someone into our office, we remove distractions, they're sitting in a quiet space, we want their optimal cognitive functioning, and that's good. However, I also would like to meet my patients where they're at, i.e., measure their cognitive functioning in real world environments and not just do it once every few years. That's sometimes what happens with neuropsychology. I mean, some people never get a neuropsychological evaluation in their lives. And there's a lot of important information we can understand about brain functioning when we measure cognition. Even if somebody does get one, a neuropsych evaluation, maybe once in their life or once every few years at most, usually. It's just not practical. But if we, and we're doing this, there's a lot of research on this now. Cognitive tests are being created and designed to be used via smartphones. And there are studies that have people complete cognitive tests on their phones multiple times a day for a few weeks. There's so much rich data you can get from that. Like, how does cognition fluctuate over time, over weeks, even within a day? We know there are circadian influences, like depending on the time of day, some people might be more cognitively sharp than others. We might be able to identify Alzheimer's disease earlier using something like this, like the earliest sign that there's memory loss, tracking cognitive recovery after stroke or traumatic brain injury, tied to cognitive rehabilitation. Just the ability to measure cognition in real world dynamic environments with good technology, I think, will revolutionize our field. So there's a lot of research on mobile cognitive testing now. It's not used clinically very much, if at all. There's challenges that we need to get around in order to start using it clinically, but that's a big one for me.
Just to run, if I can riff off of that before you go to the next topic. I also, like, related to this, we can start collecting data from different aspects of the person's life rather than specifically testing their cognition. Now everything's connected to the internet, right? Your car, your fridge, your microwave, whatever. And so we can start collecting data on how many times someone opens their fridge and whether they're driving too fast, or measure their, most people have like a smartwatch or some kind of sleep, tracking device, or different ways to assess their vocal and language abilities. We can potentially be gathering all this data, and us neuropsychologists could use it to help figure out different diagnoses, treatments, personalizing to that specific patient that we have. Obviously, privacy is potentially an issue, so we can't do this unless we can protect someone's information. But I think we could do both. We could protect the information and use it in a helpful way. So that's just kind of all related to what Ryan was talking about too.
I have a quick response, because I think I'm even thinking about it from. So I've done some neuropsychology testing and administration in earlier practicum settings. I'm more so now kind of focused and specialized in health psychology. But as you both were talking, I was just even thinking about, we have smartwatches, we have phones that also record how consistently people are exercising, what their sleep schedule is like, their nutrition, and of course, health psychology, the body, and then also the brain, how that kind of integrates together. The amount of data that you can get from an individual in terms of their cognitive functioning and also their lifestyle behaviors, I think is really exponential. And so that this is very intriguing for me. This is pretty cool.
Yeah, it won't just apply to neuropsychology. It'll apply to psychology more broadly, for sure, and health psychology. And I think, AI could help with this big data issue, because there will be too much data for, us humans to go through, and AI could help find patterns that we would never see, and that would lead us to think there's a particular diagnosis or a treatment that would work for this person. So I think AI could also help with that big data problem over time. This isn't the next few decades. I don't think it's going to happen next year. But.
Two other very quick comments. Another area that is growing and I think will have a big impact in our field is virtual reality, which I think is cool even outside of neuropsychology. Also augmented reality. In terms of our field, a way that's useful is we can measure cognition using VR in real world environments. So there's this concept of ecological validity, which suggests that our tests should be measuring what people are doing in their everyday lives. That's what we really care about. And using VR tech as it continues to improve, I can have somebody perform a cognitive task like driving, a driving simulator, or an older adult navigating around their home. If they're having some trouble with visuospatial skills and navigation, I can actually put a headset on them and then test that in a very direct way, instead of what we typically do is a more indirect way, measuring cognitive functioning. So that's another very exciting area. The limitation or the challenge with all of these, I love talking about the possibilities and all the different techs and how it could and will help. There is a lot of work that has to be done and is being done in the translation of taking the sensors that John mentioned, mobile cognitive testing, virtual reality, validating it, understanding it, translating it to the clinic, developing norms for it. That's a very big task. And so that's why it takes a while and is a slow process. But I think it sounds like the three of us, also including the health psych sphere, because I love that area, Phil. I'm thrilled to hear that that's where you're gravitating toward. I think there's a lot of potential. And so I bet the three of us can have an influence in the next few decades.
One thing I was also kind of thinking about too is I feel like so many patients, when they come in for neuropsych testing, there is the nerves, there is maybe a little bit of the anxiousness, and usually like with good rapport skills, people can kind of feel comfortable. But I always think about the real world settings and kind of the data that you're getting and how it does translate to real world settings. And I think that VR, it's amazing to think. And I think there are some fields that are already kind of using it in other different types of aspects, like exposure therapy. I think I've heard of VR, people using simulators for exposure therapy when people have certain phobias. And so using it in the way that you're talking about too is fascinating. And so, yeah, that's amazing. If there's maybe one more thing that you have, please share with us.
Yeah, I mean, there are more minor things, like we could infuse more like cognitive neuroscience tasks into what we do as neuropsychologists. A lot of that, the stuff going on in research labs is not being translated into clinical practice in a way that it could be. Those are more short-term goals that we could meet. Just like there are some organizations already working on this, like the WINS SIG of INS, the International Neuropsychological Society, where they are they have several clinics that are gathering data so that they can do computerized adaptive testing, rather than giving an entire neuropsych battery. Maybe only a half hour of that 2 hours is really relevant to the diagnosis and treatment. And so we could potentially shorten the testing time and burden if we can have these bigger data sets and be able to approach the data in a different way. So there are groups working on that. But I also just wanted to echo what Ryan said earlier, because I think it's so important that we shouldn't rush any of this. It's all very exciting, but we need to do it in a thoughtful and protected, safe way. So with any technology, that's something always to keep in the back of our minds.
That is super helpful and super exciting to think about the future and what that holds, especially for, I'm sure, people in high school or in college who are thinking of neuropsychology, wanting to become a neuropsychologist, all of the exciting things that they might be able to even learn through in their graduate program and then also in their internship or postdoc. One of the things that I wanted to do with both of you was maybe do kind of like a rapid fire, how to become a neuropsychologist. And so I was thinking maybe we could go through, what advice you would give for a high school student, a college student, just different situations. And I'll kind of split up the questions for the both of you. And so Ryan, we'll start with you. If someone is in graduate school, or actually if someone is in high school and they're wanting to go to college and become a neuropsychologist, what is one piece of advice that you would give them?
Sure. Happy to talk through this. I think if it's all right, the way I'll answer is rapid fire with a few ideas, and that would be helpful.
There's no rapid fire with psychologists and podcasters.
It depends. It's so hard to do. We experience this with our podcast. We sometimes ask people, can you tell us the one thing to improve neuropsychology? And then a lot of people are like, well, let me give you 3 things to improve neuropsychology. So one resource for folks is that in our book, Becoming a Neuropsychologist, we have a chapter on this. A few of my high point takeaways would be what I mentioned earlier. Only go this route if you truly enjoy the topic area. So, start reading about, listening about neuropsychology and think about if it really does it for you. Curiosity and conscientiousness are incredibly important characteristics for success in our field, in my opinion. John mentioned earlier how important writing skills are. I completely agree. So writing and speaking, that's about everything we do: writing, speaking, reading, listening. And so, cultivating, working on your skills as a writer and a speaker, which doesn't have to be about neuropsychology at the high school level, just general, good skills in those areas. And then more specific would be try to take a class or 2 in college, if you can, related to biopsychology, psychology, and or neuroscience. Some high schools may have a psychology class. Beyond that, reading about those topic areas, as much as you can or as much as you're interested in, that will help you learn about them, which will make you more competitive, and it will give you more information to help you make the best decision about the career path for you. Because some people might be interested in neuropsych, but then find out eventually that they'd rather go into health psychology, for example, which is a great area. Maybe that's a better fit, or trauma-focused treatment or medicine. So zeroing in. And then the other quick ones are trying to identify an advisor, like a teacher or academic advisor who knows about neuropsychology, who you have a good relationship with, who can, guide and mentor you. And then when you get into college, try to join a research lab in something related to psychology or neuroscience. I'll stop for there. I think I gave you like 8 things and you asked for 1. So
no, that was great. This is excellent. I'm sure there's going to be people who are like, yes, feed me all this information. All right. And then we'll go to you, John. So let's say someone is in college, they're wanting to go into graduate school. What are some of the things that you would suggest or advise them in terms of getting into grad school?
Getting into grad school. Well, Ryan already stole it. I mean, I think, any kind of research, if you are looking into a PhD program, especially, it is going to be necessary. They're going to be asking about your research experience on your interviews. And you don't have to have a publication. Most people do not have a publication before they enter grad school, but if you can, do whatever whatever possible to at least be involved in a research project, be an author, even if you're the second to last author on a paper or a poster at a conference. Just anything related to research will help you get into grad school, and maybe even more importantly, will help you to decide whether it's something you are interested in, because you will do a lot more research in grad school. So if there's one thing, I think it would be that.
Oh, that's perfect. Okay, so then back to you, Ryan. What if someone now is finally in grad school, they're getting ready to prepare, hopefully, to get that match in the neuropsychology internship? What should they do during their grad school program?
Right. Yeah. I like how you're moving along the trajectory here. So if someone's in grad school and thinking about internship, one piece of good news is that there aren't neuropsychology internships per se. There are clinical psychology internships that have varying degrees of focus or concentration in neuropsychology, which I frame that as good news, because that means it's not an all or nothing situation. It's not like, oh, there are these few neuropsych internships and you got to get one of those, and if not, then you're screwed. That's not the case. John had referenced earlier how there's really this pyramid effect where in grad school and even on internship, we're really focused on the foundations. And foundations are clinical psychology, generally, psychopathology, psychometrics, therapy, and research methods. And in order to be a good neuropsychologist, it's really essential that you're a good clinical psychologist to start. And that extends to internship. So you'll be applying to clinical psych internships, and they will have varying degrees of specialization, time spent doing more neuropsych specific activities. So depending on what your interests are, if listeners are especially interested in neuropsychology during grad school and they know that's the route they want to go, I think it makes sense to target the more neuropsych heavy internship programs. At the same time, think about your own gaps. Like nobody knows everything. So what are areas that would be good for you to brush up on? Say you don't have very much psychotherapy experience. Psychotherapy is incredibly important for neuropsychologists, even if we're not doing it actively every day. Just having had that training helps a great deal. So, each person's different. Each situation will be different. You'll have in grad school, you'll have a mentor and various clinical psych, neuropsych faculty and colleagues to talk to, figure out what your interests are, what your gaps are, and what programs are, options for you, and then try to pick some of the best that fill those gaps. Certainly those programs that have more of a neuropsych emphasis would make sense for someone who's looking for a career in our field.
Wow. And back to you, John. So let's say someone has actually been a practicing psychologist. They're not a neuropsychologist. They're just practicing as a psychologist. Maybe they have had a little bit of experience of neuropsychology in their practicum settings in grad school, but they are wanting to become board certified and become a professional neuropsychologist. So maybe they didn't get into kind of a neuro track internship. They didn't do a fellowship. What would you recommend for that person?
Yeah, this is always a difficult topic, because there's not a single kind of right answer. It really depends on what the person has for their training background and what they've been doing in their professional life. We have a whole section in our book on retraining as a neuropsychologist, kind of retreading in our field. And so let's take like the easiest one, where they are a clinical psychologist. They got a doctorate in clinical psychology. They were working as a psychologist, but they didn't ever do a fellowship, and they don't have. Maybe they had some neuropsych training in grad school, but nothing beyond that. People will differ in how they answer this. I think Ryan and I will both agree. Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, that you really need the fellowship. There's nothing that you can do on your own that would make you become a neuropsychologist. You really need the formal training of a fellowship, a 2-year fellowship, and that's what the American Board of Clinical Neuropsychology has laid out in order to become board certified, to be eligible for board certification in our specialty. The formal 2-year fellowship is non-negotiable. There are different ways to do it. It's not like it has to be at an academic medical center. You can do it in a private practice, but there are certain guidelines that you have to meet. And we lay that out in the book. The American Board of Clinical Neuropsychology has it also laid out. So we can go over the specifics if you want, but that's really how you specialize in our field.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And especially, I'm sure, as years from now, decades from now, as neuropsychology, I think, becomes more of maybe a protected name. I personally know a lot of psychologists who do neuropsych testing, but aren't necessarily neuropsychology board certified themselves. But I'm sure in the future, this is going to be a very protected name, and you want to make sure that you have that experience, especially for those who are looking to get into the field. Thank you both for that. I think we have one more question, or time for one more question. I'd love to know in general for the both of you what research experience was like during grad school, maybe in your dissertation, poster presentations, what you studied, and different things like that.
Sure. Good one. Good question to end on. For me, in grad school, I used what we call in our book the shotgun approach, meaning I did a little bit of work in a lot of different areas in grad school. We contrast that with a laser focus, where some people in grad school get into a lab that's focusing on a very specific topic and do a lot of work in depth in that area. Mine was broader, and neither of those options is right or wrong. They're just different based on what the situation you're in and your interests. My grad program was very clinically oriented, and I am very interested in research. The clinical piece was great. In terms of the research side, realizing that I wanted a career in research, what it took was to find opportunities. So I was in a research lab that was just getting up and started, and that area was primarily early detection of Alzheimer's disease using a computerized cognitive test. So I spent a lot of time on that. That's what my dissertation was on, collecting data using this computerized cued Stroop test in older adults who had biomarker risk for Alzheimer's disease and trying to detect it early. Then I also networked and worked on clinical data sets with my clinical supervisors. I worked with other faculty at the grad program. I did work in stroke, returning to work following stroke. Public knowledge about traumatic brain injury was a different project. Decision making in people with substance use disorders was a different area. Just essentially anything neuropsych related that was available to me, I was interested in and worked on to the degree that I had time to. So ended up being a diverse portfolio, which has pros and cons. That was my experience.
That's awesome.
Ryan is a research machine. And if he won the lottery tomorrow, he would be on a desert island doing research. So,
I love that.
It is probably true, as scary as that is.
He would be on some kind of tropical island doing research. I also took a shotgun kind of style approach in grad school. I said I do a lot less research now, but in grad school, I did as much as I could because I knew that would look good for internship programs and postdoctoral fellowships. And so I mainly did behavioral testing on different rodent models of injuries and diseases. So one of my most publications, I think, in grad school was from a grant that we got from NASA to study the effects of radiation on mice that were genetically predispositioned to develop Alzheimer's disease-like pathology, the plaques that develop in humans. There's a similar model in mice, not the same, but similar. And so I was the one doing the mazes with them. I would put them in the water maze or the Barnes maze, and the different behavioral tests to look at their memory and other behavioral sorts of parameters on these mice. So that was different. And then I knew I wanted to be a clinician, a clinical neuropsychologist. And so for my dissertation, then I made sure to work with a clinical population, a human, population. So I looked at actually pomegranate supplementation after stroke in the immediate post-stroke phase, because I was at a stroke rehab unit at the time, and so it was a randomized controlled trial for pomegranate supplement after stroke. So totally varied, but like Ryan, just did whatever I could research-wise, and enjoyed it.
And ever since then, John is now proselytized for pomegranate supplements. And no, he hasn't. But John and I trained together at Brown, and I remember when John was a postdoc fellow there, he gave his talk on brain health to me and all the other trainees, very, very well articulated. And several of us realized that after his talk, like the next day, we went and bought some pomegranates. Out of
all the things that I talked about, that's the one thing that anybody
the only thing that we remember.
Yeah. Love that. It's really cool, John, that you got to, because I don't think I've ever heard of a grad student who's in the field of neuropsychology kind of working with animals and then also being able to work clinically with a population. So I always think of working with mice or rats more of the neuroscience focus for those neuroscience labs. And so that's really neat that you got to have that experience. I think that's for both of y'all really, really neat research experiences.
If I could just say thank you to my grad school mentor, Rich Hartman, because it was really his lab. It was luck that I was there at the time where he was accepting students. So I just it's not my doing. It was something I lucked into.
Well, we have a lasting tradition in this podcast and channel. I'd love to know for both of y'all, what do you do for just health-wise, mental, physical, spiritual? I know the field can be demanding. There's so many different responsibilities. How do you stay on top of it and taking care of yourself?
Yeah, I can start. I'm glad that you incorporated this into your podcast, because it is so important. Self-care. Everyone will talk about it. Some people give it lip service and don't actually do it. Ryan and I both work quite hard and spend a lot of time on our academic and clinical projects, pursuits, but we both really value self-care, and my couple things that go to the top of my list are pickleball and racquetball. So I'm actually close to Loma Linda University, and they have the gym here with pretty active pickleball and racquetball scenes. So any racket sports is my way to kind of decompress and have fun. And then I also have two young daughters, so they also keep me busy and help with my self-care, even if I don't. They force me to stop working if I'm working.
We play tug of war with John. I'm trying to rope him into some new crazy cockamamie research project, and the family is reminding him of what's actually important.
That's awesome.
So John and I have a lot of overlapping interests. For me, ways to unwind, I love hiking. I happen to live next to a state forest, which I tell everybody who will listen, because I think is the greatest thing ever. I walk outside, very fortunate. I walk outside and there's a trailhead right there. So when it's feasible, I take meetings on the phone while hiking, which is great. But also I'm hiking many days of the week, listening to audiobooks, podcasts, enjoying some solitude. That's great. Friends, family, for sure. Also very helpful. As I mentioned earlier, something that helps in terms of mental health and work-life balance and quality of life when you work a lot is if you enjoy the work. I do not live and breathe neuropsychology. Don't believe what John tells you. I do have interests outside of neuropsych, but when doing something related to neuropsychology, this podcast right now or anything else we've talked about today, it's not a drag. It's fun, and so it doesn't feel as draining as it might for people who, unfortunately, are in a job and need to make a paycheck. It's very understandable, but the work itself is just really tough. Neuropsychology is challenging, but also really rewarding.
Well, I definitely want to thank you both for your time. It's been really amazing to hear both of your knowledge, your experience, your training, your expertise in neuropsychology, but to see the diversity of the way that you go about it. I think it just paints a really great, just broad picture of what the field is right now and what it could be. And I'm really excited for those who are potentially going to pursue this career. And I'm definitely going to leave all of the links that you provided me in the show notes with the book and the podcast. Anything else that you all would like to promote, if anything?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say, I mentioned New to Neuropsychology, N2N for short, earlier, and it's really an organization. Taylor Schmidt is the creator and leader of it, so she deserves most of the credit. But there's a whole team working to help students find the field of neuropsychology, especially people in underrepresented groups and backgrounds, and then to help them through the process. There's some financial resources. There are lots of resources. So hopefully you'll link to that website, and people should check it out because it's really, they're doing great work. I also wanted to just thank you for not only the invitation, but even more so for the channel that you've created and the podcast. More of this, the better, and you're doing it in a really great way and in a really entertaining and solid way. So thank you for putting all the work in, because the more the better, getting the word out.
Yep. I'm going to pile on. Phil, very impressed with what you're doing with your show. And John and I have a little bit of experience with podcasting, and you've got a great podcast host presence. Like as a guest on your show, I feel very valued and welcome, and this has been a lot of fun. So you have work-life balance to think about too, but to the degree you have bandwidth, this is great what you're doing.
Well, thank you both again so much. We'll definitely have to bring you on again in the future. And this was great. I really appreciate all of the wisdom and nuggets of just information that you poured out. So thank you again, and we'll see y'all next time.
Sounds great.